Suicide Justice series is named after Kristen Cardon's article, Suicide Justice, which informed by the practice of comparative reading, Black feminist scholarship, really tries to relocate the study and our social responses to suicide within a more explicit set of ethical commitments that implicate interlocking sites of social struggle at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, economy, indigeneity, disability, among and many other interlocking sites of movement. I'm really delighted to invite and have present to you all today a dear colleague and friend, Dr. Nicole Dunn. Among the many qualities I could speak about Dr. Dunn, Dr. Dunn is recently a Dunn PhD student of the Critical Health and Social Action Lab, and recently graduated with her PhD from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development in the Counseling and Clinical Psychology doctoral program. I got to know Nicole over the last few years, well, I guess 6 years altogether now, which is
Yeah.
wild, over the course of working together in the context of her graduate studies. But in those 6 years, I've gotten to collaborate with you. I've most appreciated just the opportunities to have meaningful, reflective, deep conversations with you about the work that we do, our ethical responsibilities in the work that we do, and how to do our work in more creative, transgressive, um, connective ways. In our lab, the Critical Health and Social Action Lab, we often talk about the work we do as but part of a constellation. And I see Nicole's work in this field and more broadly the work that she's doing in the intersections of gender and housing justice and suicide justice as a bright star in a constellation of work and in movements committed to committed to making more livable lives and lives of dignity for all people. And I'm just really, really humbled and grateful for her being willing to share her thoughts and her research with us today. I could go on and on. I won't because I feel like it might make you feel uncomfortable and embarrassed or certain. But I think the world of you, Nicole, and I'm really excited for the work that you're doing and what you are bringing to our community of scholarship. And I'm delighted that there's a wide group of folks joining us today from around Canada and folks who are also interested in these topics. But also, I just want to say that I think this set of topics that we're bringing to the forefront today are more timely than ever. We're living in a time of racing and quickening social, economic inequality that internationally is also connected to shifting values and movements. And I just think this is going to be a really exciting conversation, and I'm really grateful that you've followed up on the invitation to join us today. So I would invite you all, wherever you are today, to join me in giving a great digital round of applause to Nicole. And if you want, use your cool reaction buttons to do so. And you can take it away, Nicole.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jeff. I just so appreciate that intro. And yeah, it's so nice to be here and kind of back in the lab space in some capacity. Um, I guess good morning to everyone from the West Coast. It's really good to be with you all. And I know this time of year brings up a spectrum of emotions and demands. So if you're here, I'm really glad that you're here. Also really glad to have the opportunity to speak about some pieces from my doctoral thesis, which looked at the relationships between housing injustice, suicidality, and gender for young women and femme folks. And today I'll be thinking through a new dimension around how these factors are spatialized and felt. And so the title of this talk is Sensing Suicidality and Survival in Cities, Spatializing the Relationship Between Gender, Housing, and Suicide. I'd also just really like to quickly thank the many generous sponsors who made this work possible in the most ethical sense. So Queen's University, SHRC Canada, the Critical Health and Social Action Lab, and the University of Toronto. Okay. So I'm joining this morning from the gorgeous traditional ancestral and unceded Musqueam territory, which means a place where the river grass grows. I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. But the research and stories that we will witness today are actually largely situated within Treaty 13 territory, Toronto, a name which means a place in the water where the trees stand tall. And the image on this screen is from a place in Toronto called Allen Gardens Conservatory, which is a little arboretum located in a park at Sherbourne and Gerrard Street that is completely free to the public. It's a large neoclassical building. It has 5 connecting greenhouses, where the most iconic is this 16-sided glass dome that houses palm trees. It's a place that's always warm. It smells like nature. It has a public washroom, and it nurtures all sorts of plants native to this land and not. And outside of the greenhouse, there's a large park. There's a dog park section, and there's many benches to just sit and stay a while. It's near a major subway stop, and it's on the 506 streetcar line. And there's grocery stores that are all walkable, and a few community and health centers that are kind of tucked in and around the perimeter. So symbolically, Allen Gardens Conservatory feels like a place that intimately symbolizes some of the issues that we're going to talk about here today. Beyond the glass walls of this beautiful arboretum, there's an encampment that's been housing hundreds of people. It's a space which has been subjected to intense surveillance and law enforcement. And no less than 8 weeks ago, the encampment has allegedly been cleared, and its occupants have been offered shelter. And yet people continuously return to this space. Allen Gardens is a sacred space, and it's been home to many Indigenous peoples for millennia who have taken care of the land, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's been a place of social movements against anti-Black racism and trans misogyny, grassroots food sovereignty organizing, pride, resisting the G20 and G8 summits, an anti-fascist race riot in 1965, the Slut Walk, and a female mock government in the 1800s. So Allen Gardens is really a place that has its roots in advancing a good life. So I just wanted to invite everyone listening to maybe think about the place that you are, the land that you're on, and if the land could speak, what story might it tell about housing injustice? These issues, suicide, gender-based violence, and housing injustice, they affect all of us in different ways, personally, professionally, historically, or within our community. So I just want to remind everyone, wherever you are, to just take care of yourself during this presentation in whatever way fits for you. I did want to provide just a very brief snapshot on how I arrived to this work, and this actually brings me to another city. My dissertation was conceptualized in 2018 while I was working 2 jobs in unceded Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa. I spent half the week at an Indigenous Women's Center as a child and youth counselor and a Children Who Witness Violence program. And then the other half of the week, I spent working for a local hospital researching the delivery of psychotherapy to unhoused folks with a diagnosis of PTSD. So although in both roles, I worked with people experiencing housing injustice and suicidality, I noticed that how young people, and particularly young women and femme folks, access care looked strikingly different depending on where I was working in the city. So at the Women's Center, young women and femme folk facing housing injustice found themselves couch surfing, exchanging services for shelter, living with extended family or former partners, and car sleeping. But while I was working in and around the Byward Market, unhoused female and femme youth were scarce and sometimes nowhere to be seen at all, but there was a overwhelmingly strong adult male presence. And so noticing this contrast in care is what prompted some of my research questions. We know that housing injustice is a serious issue in Canada, and according to a 2016 survey, on average, 7,000 youth don't have a place to stay each night. And among this population, 36.4% identified as female, and 60% of youth surveyed have attempted suicide at least once. And these numbers are based on a point in time count from 2016, and actually these numbers are quite outdated now. The typology of housing injustice that tends to characterize the experiences of young women in femme is called hidden houselessness. And this is because this population doesn't seek help in ways that are captured in conventional public health service use, like point in time counts or shelter access. And this is important because it means that these young people are seeking shelter in a way that actively refuses public services. And this is really important. Instead, we see that young women and femfolk have been known to seek shelter through other means like exchanging services, car sleeping, van living, couch surfing, living with extended family, living with exes. And to date, it's estimated that the number of people experiencing hidden houselessness is actually 3 to 4 times greater than what we can count because we're not seeing it in public service use. But at its core, housing injustice is a human rights violation. And so my doctoral program of research was really based on this observation that young women and femme folks are not passive observers in their own survival, and that they resist stability in creative and life-affirming ways, even if it incurs new forms of risk or danger. So in the fall of 2022, I met with approximately 23 incredible young people who identified as struggling with suicidal ideation across their lifetime. Everyone identified as female or femme, and everyone was between the ages of 19 and 24. And one of my key research questions was, what are the ecological dimensions that inform the suicidal distress of young women and femme folks facing housing injustice? And this question comes from a curiosity about wanting to understand distress beyond individual notions of risk. And so the young people shared their life stories through a narrative inquiry and shared personal pieces of art that were collated into a zine that's freely accessible on the link that you see on the website or on the slide. And so instead of focusing on the nature of each person's experience of suicide attempts, I asked folks to share various stories with me that felt really important to understanding their life. And then I analyzed these stories through language, context, and emotion to see what themes might be constructed and what they might say about livability. And this is what I developed. So what you're looking at are the themes that came from this research project. And there's a few things that stand out to me when I look at these, especially all of them together. And one is the structural nature of challenges gestured through language like system, materials, and organized abandonment. And the other has to do with the affects that accompany these themes and the ways that they gesture towards emotions like fear, loneliness, and anger. And one of the ways that I make sense of these two observations is through a reflection that was provided to me by Dr. Ansloos that although many of these themes exist at the structural level or the distal level, if you're looking through a public health framing, they're actually felt very proximately or very close to home by co-researchers. There are also themes that are tied to context and specifically to places that young people found themselves seeking care. And so one of the most surprising findings of my thesis concerned how closely the suffering and survivance of participants resonated with concepts from concepts that were found in the field of feminist geography and urban planning, and in some cases more so than clinical psychology, which is where I spend most of my time. And this is in line with what Kristen Carden says about advancing settler suicidology, that it will take more than one discipline to ease the suffering that precedes suicide. And so today we're going to talk about space and place. I've been thinking a lot about Indigenous feminist Athabascan scholar Deanne Million's concept of felt theory, where felt theory emphasizes the importance of emotions in articulating our realities. And she says, we need models for what can be achieved by felt action, actions informed by experience and analysis by a felt theory. I believe that these knowledges and practices represent significant political interventions or counter-hegemonic moves. And what I appreciate about her work is that she highlights that objectivity and rationality can never truly capture our lived experiences, and that the individualization of struggle through shame is a tactic to obscure colonial violence. So my hope today is to use emotions to make sense of the slow violence of patriarchy, transmisogyny, racism, ageism, and classism that shape the ways that young women and femmes survive in spaces and places. And we'll look at some terms offered by feminist geography to understand how the built environment and context influences livability. And I'm especially interested in how felt theory might be able to offer us new insights about how we can use hard feelings as a compass for understanding the unique logics of life and death. So instead of seeing emotions as a predictor of suicide, I'm curious about how emotions may help us understand the meanings behind suicide. I also feel like attending to emotions is important here because it speaks to what Dr. Amy Chandler says about hermeneutic justice, that we can't expect people to have the language to name and describe structural violence since these narratives are lived out in daily life as normal. So in the words of Indigenous poet Billy Ray Belcourt from Driftpile Cree Nation, rotting worlds are set in motion before we can even study them. And so today I hope we can all be good witnesses to suffering, survivance, and resistance. And as we listen to some of the stories shared, perhaps we might be able to engage in a practice of counter-visuality where we can shift our gaze from suffering bodies onto systems and structures that uphold violence as a practice of accountability. And in this way, we can know that life just doesn't have to be this way. So these are the three concepts from feminist geography that I'm going to be drawing on. And Ivy, Jay, Adriana, and Jamie are going to help us make sense of them through the generosity of their lived experiences. So the first concept we're going to look at is called the geography of women's fear. And this is from a subfield in geography that pays close attention to how women, girls, and gender diverse folks may not feel safe in male-dominated spaces, and how fears of violence shape the vibrations of a city. The author, Valentine, 1989, paid close attention to how public spaces are controlled, occupied, and by whom. And they argue that the way women use space is a spatial expression of patriarchy. Women's fear of male violence does not, therefore, just take place in space, but is tied up with the way public space is used, occupied, and controlled by different groups at different times. And this is important because in the context of housing injustice, the fear of violence may provide an explanation for the phenomenon of hidden houselessness, because people whose gender expresses femininity are much less likely to seek support from male-dominated spaces like shelters or places that promote feelings of shame. Okay, so I want to introduce us to Ivy. Ivy and I met at an inner city youth drop-in center. She's a young, white female, and she identifies as someone who self-harms. And this coping mechanism has left her with low levels of hemoglobin that make it difficult to expend energy in a city going from place to place. And Ivy tells me that she has experienced various typologies of houselessness, such as trading services for financial support, shelter living, provisional accommodation, and living with no fixed address. And when we met, Ivy wonders openly if she'll survive this next chapter of her life. She tells me her dream job is to work for Kids Help Phone, and she wants to be a really good listener for kids struggling. Ivy is friendly, she's warm, she's well-spoken. In my interactions with her, she's clearly just so thoughtful of others. So in the following example, Ivy speaks about navigating Toronto pre-COVID as an unhoused youth. And I'm going to read what she says. I had no fixed address in grade 12. However, I did have a membership to a gym. And also there were a few 24/7 places in the city that I would go. But due to its proximity to my high school, staying near the plaza made a lot of sense. It was a 10-minute walk from my high school, and it was open 24/7. As long as you're not asleep, they would let you stay. And also, like, I have privilege as a young white person. Like, normally being female is not a privilege because men are disgusting. But in this case, I think it was a privilege just because they saw me as more vulnerable or whatever, or like they didn't think I was a threat or anything. And so they just let me stay. I slept wherever I could sleep, but it was never a good sleep. I'd sleep in school with my head down. I was barely awake during classes. So what I did was I shifted my sleep schedule. So during the night, because I was awake, I would be studying. And then during the day, I would be in class, but I would have my head down and sleep. But it wasn't like REM sleep. I needed to sleep really badly, and I cried a lot during that time because I was so sleep deprived, and it just makes you so emotional. But then the pandemic happened, everything closed, and I was not cut out for being on the street. So looking at this text through the lens of felt theory encourages us to pay attention to how Ivy's feelings like fear, exhaustion, and moments of vulnerability are deeply tied to the environment that she inhabits and her positionality. Ivy's navigation of public spaces reveals how urban settings are not structured with her in mind. And as Valentine notes, women's fear in cities often stems from experiences of vulnerability to violence in both real and perceived ways. Ivy's whiteness and youthfulness create a perceived vulnerability that allows her to have access to places like the plaza where she's not seen as a threat. And this stands in contrast to her racialized peers who she observes are more likely to face criminalization or exclusion in similar contexts. And in this way, we can see the intersectional nature of spatial safety and access. Ivy's also reliant on 24/7 spaces, and this also reflects a cityscape that is marred by increasing privatization. Her description of shifting her sleep schedule to prioritize studying during the night shows how her survival is mediated by the city's policy-driven rhythms, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. It might be tempting to see Ivy's exhaustion as an individual experience, but through the lens of felt theory, we can see it as a broader critique of systemic neglect and the embodied consequences of structural violence. Ivy's fear shapes her mobility and invites her to live life through a constant assessment of risk. And Ivy's experiences, in some ways, by extension, resonate with discourses surrounding 15-minute cities, which refers to an urban planning concept designed to create compact, livable communities where residents can access all essential services like work, education, healthcare, shopping, leisure, within a 15-minute walk or bike ride from where you live. However, proposals for 15-minute cities are curiously controversial. So in the next story, we're going to join Ivy back in time from a scene from her childhood. And she shares here that she is being held in a hospital. She tells me that she jumped out of a tree and was hoping to break her arm. At the time, she was seeking medication that would help her manage feelings of badness that followed violence at home. Once at the hospital, she was formed. And this is what she says about her experience in the hospital environment. She says, I loved the nurses, but I dreaded every meeting with the psychiatrist because it was an interrogation. She wanted me to say certain things, and then they had me talk to a literal policewoman, like a police investigator. And I said, no, why? It was not what I wanted. It wasn't. I'm pretty sure I didn't say yes to this, or maybe they're taking my non-no as a yes. But I didn't know in that position I could say no. I was a little child, and what they don't realize is how much worse they made me. And then they put me on a one-to-one where you have someone with you 24 hours of the day. Ivy's description here of her hospital experience highlights how the environment has been shaped by different power imbalances. She juxtaposes her positive feelings towards the nurse with the dread she felt when interacting with a psychiatrist and a police officer. This dread that she talks about, a sense of foreboding or looming fear, stems from the coercive and interrogative nature of those interactions where her autonomy and consent were undermined. Her reflection that she didn't know in that position I could say no reveals how the institutional setting might have rendered her voiceless, infantilized, or unable to advocate for herself. Ivy's narrative illustrates how the hospital space itself becomes a site of destabilizing social interactions. Hospitals are often framed as spaces of healing, but for Ivy, they acted as a setting for interrogation, coercion, and surveillance. And although Ivy's security of place is managed in that her location is predictable, she still experiences unsafety in new forms of paternalistic and carceral care. Ivy's mistrust here is not abstract. It exists at the relational dynamics of ageism, sexism, and saneism in a hospital setting. So as an experience that predates her experience of housing injustice, we might wonder how this shifting experience of safety in a hospital might influence which pathways she seeks to take care in the future. So the two stories that Ivy shared invite us to think about safety in ways that move away from the bifurcation of safe or unsafe. Ivy's experiences point to a troubling reality for many young women and femme folk that they are hyper-visible on the streets and then they become invisibilized in healthcare. And as Edwards and Maxwell highlight, safety is best understood as a transient and situational process between the person and the particularities of a place, felt in and through the body. Thinking about unsafety relationally offers the potential to capture the multiplicity and sociocultural elements that are constantly reconfigured in spatiotemporal contexts to produce different affectual states that may change into one another in a nonlinear fashion. And so for Ivy, while emotion is the compass that helps her navigate her experiences through the city, the routes to care she takes are influenced by a relational nexus of policy and urban planning. Okay. The second concept I want to introduce us to is one of shrinking worlds. And this concept really resonated with the stories shared by the young people I met and through my own observations as a former Torontonian. Shrinking worlds refers to how mobility through physical and social environments are diminished through austerity, thereby squeezing out the breadth of lived experience that a person can have. The shrinking of our world is an insidious, barely perceptible process, the cumulative effects of dwelling in wounded and contracting ecologies, spaces which our existence collapses into tighter and more suffocating shells. And what I find most compelling about this concept of shrinking worlds is that it highlights how feelings of isolation and dependency are structurally driven. And as Hitchin and Shaw observe, a geographical approach to mental health would ask, how is the spatial violence of austerity interiorized, felt, and negotiated in everyday landscapes? As common spaces disappear, do we shrink back into ourselves, tossed ever inwards? And in Toronto, we don't have to look far to see the world shrinking. We see it in the creation of provincial maps charting paths to obtaining alcohol, while at the same time the closure of safe consumption sites, the closure of central bike lanes across Toronto in favor of remediating vehicle congestion, the sale of gorgeous protected green space to private vendors and luxury spas, the removal of rent caps and the implementation of the notwithstanding clause to remove encampments from public spaces. And so the way young women and femme folk experience housing in Toronto is carefully worlded by these shrinking worlds and conditions of austerity. And yet austerity demands that these young people be resilient anyways. So the next person I want to introduce us to is Jay. They're a young Black femme accessing a youth drop-in in downtown Toronto. And this is where we met. Jay explains that for me to understand their life story best, we have to understand their parents' life story, which was characterized by financial instability and chaos. And Jay tells me that the first couple years of their life were full of memories about moving around as their family tried to find stable ground in the city. Jay was kicked out when they were 16 after an argument with their mother. As a result, they faced various typologies of housing injustice, like no fixed address, couch surfing with friends, shelter living, and provisional accommodation. And Jay believes in the importance of community, mutual aid, and lifting each other up. They also believe in the healing power of joy. So in the following example, Jay talks about finally becoming housed after years of living with no fixed address. And this is what they say. I noticed when you're put into like a high stress situation from being homeless to getting a place, you become complacent and you kind of go off on all the little things that you wanted to do. At least for me, that's what happened. I became complacent. I became okay with the little job I had. I worked at a coffee conglomerate, and it's not a little job, but it's like, it's not much. I became okay living in a really tiny bedroom. I gave up on wanting an apartment or a higher point of my career. I felt accomplished in the sense where I dealt with this high stress situation and I got out of it. And now that I'm not dealing with this high stress situation, you know, you become a bit complacent in what you want. And then all of a sudden, my kidneys failed, and I realized my income right now isn't where it needs to be. I didn't have money saved because my income was just enough to get by. Hmm. Okay, so here Jay shares that they experienced emotional exhaustion from surviving a high stress situation, and this exhaustion is compounded by austerity's material consequences, such as low wages that prevent accruing savings. Jay's experience of complacency isn't a lack of ambition. Rather, it's a reflection of how austerity enforces a narrow bandwidth of survival-focused thinking. Overcoming houselessness provided a high point in Jay's story, but the systemic barriers to upward mobility made it difficult to sustain the energy needed to aim for more. Jay's story also shows how austerity disrupts their ability to project themselves into the future and to have the capacity to aspire. Their kidneys failing and the realization of inadequate savings demonstrates how austerity denies individuals the economic surplus needed to plan for crises. Jay's immediate urgency of survival overpowers their long-term aspirations, and Jay's sense of time becomes compressed into cycles of just getting by. Jay's embodied experience working an energy-draining job, managing health crises, and living in suboptimal conditions reveal the ways in which austerity is deeply felt and state-driven. And in this way, the complacency Jay critiques in themselves can be read as a survival mechanism rather than a personal failing. But nonetheless, Jay may still experience this as shame and blame turned inwards. Okay. So in this next story, Jay describes the transformative power of joy that they experience through leisure. Jay grew up in a neighborhood called University Heights or Black Creek, which was previously referred to as Jane and Finch, and this name reflects its major intersection. This is an area that represents over 80 ethno-cultural groups from predominantly Africa, Asia, South America, the West Indies, and the Middle East. Jane and Finch is a historically underinvested area that has been characterized by high-density high-rises. It's a place that has lacked public infrastructure like a subway line, bus routes, resources like schools, healthcare, employment opportunities. And even though its community residents have consistently advocated for its betterment, it's a neighborhood that is still marred by stereotypes that stigmatize and criminalize its residents to this day. And Jay's story reflects how systemic racism constrains the possibilities of joy and self-expression. So in this next example, Jay says, I want to own my own social circus, especially because of the impact that it had on me. I run it specifically for low-income areas, and this is important, especially for me as a Black woman. And if we had more exposure to these activities in our area, I feel like it would give kids another thing for them to do that isn't a bad influence. Just something fun for them to do and remind Black kids and just kids everywhere, but especially in low-income areas, that it's okay to have fun. It's okay to be a kid, to remind kids and adults how to be kids, how to have fun, and how to enjoy life. Jay's desire to create a social circus stems from their lived experience of a shrinking world where access to enriching and playful activities were blunted by disinvestment. And felt theory helps us understand how the shrinking world has been experienced emotionally and socially through reduced opportunities for leisure and the normalization of stress. Jay's commitment to providing these activities is an act of resistance and community love aimed at counteracting the shrinking. Jay wants to expand the horizons of what is possible for their community, by their community, and for their community with joy. And through Jay's identification as a Black woman, they also situate this project within a broader effort to affirm the humanity of people living in neighborhoods where there has been profound racism and misogyny. They recognize that racial capitalism erodes the right to simply be a kid and experience fun without judgment or consequence. And by emphasizing the importance of joy and play, Jay challenges the constraints of shrinking worlds and to see Jane and Finch as a place of possibility and joy. So Jay's experience of complacency and joy invites us to ask questions about how the city generates its own theory of good living and life. Jay's story points to the necessity of economic redistribution and community investment to support thriving neighborhoods. After all, who can believe in a world that no longer believes in them? And importantly, Jay's experience of joy is driven by their love for their community, and we can see their contributions to lift others up. I think Jay's desires for change and success in their own programming speak to a need for significant social investment guided by participatory governance. In the docuseries Life Size City, Ken Greenberg states that people have a right to change themselves by changing their city. And I love this point because through this lens, we can see that suicide justice is perhaps an issue of democracy and not just one of individual struggle. And this observation is consistent with what Mark Button calls for a political approach to suicide prevention, where securing the right to good living conditions is a part of good prevention. And so the last concept I'm going to introduce us to is one called chronic urban trauma. And we're going to look at two different zines from Adriana and Jamie. So there's many ways to conceptualize trauma, and it is sometimes described colloquially in two ways. Big T trauma, which refers to major life-threatening events like natural disasters, war, or violence, and little t trauma, which includes less overt but still deeply distressing experiences like bullying or neglect. Trauma can also be thought of temporally as a limited time event or repeated and complex. Eduardo Duran, an Apache Tiwa Lakota psychologist, talks about trauma as a soul wound, something that doesn't just affect the mind, but also cuts into a person's spiritual and cultural sense of self. Judith Herman adds this by explaining that trauma shatters a person's sense of shared humanity, often leaving them grappling with painful questions like, how could this happen and why wasn't it stopped? So building on these ideas through the lens of geography, Rachel Payne from Newcastle University introduces the concept of chronic urban trauma. And she explains that trauma doesn't just live inside people, it gets embedded into the places we inhabit. She says, wounding is spatially and temporally dynamic, working both metonymically through social ecologies of place and loss of routines, and psychosocially through residents' intimate relationships with the city. And using this frame, we can see how certain neighborhoods, streets, or even whole cities can carry the weight of repeated harm, becoming triggers that consistently re-trigger and re-traumatize people who live there. And it's a reminder that trauma isn't just personal, it's collective and it's woven into the fabric of where we live. So meet Adriana. They're a two-spirit youth tenting in one of Toronto's many church-run organizations that allow folks to take refuge on their property. Adriana wrote a poem called It Sounds Like a Summer, and I'm going to read it. It sounds like a summer. I felt safe there in the tent, having a couple of trees back there. Just to have that nature there was really nice. It covered the sun most of the day. The tent covered me. I had a place to lay my head. It was a community. Many days out in the rain, it would be muddy back there, but it still felt safe. Do you miss it? No. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, 19 weeks, but I've been homeless longer than that. For 5 years now, since I came to Toronto, I'm still homeless. It's like they forgot about me. By Adriana. So in their poem, Adriana describes the tent as a rare site of safety and stability within the chronic instability of Toronto. Adriana emphasizes the tent's protective qualities against human rights violations and the small but important comforts of nature and having green space. And despite the physical hardship of mud, rain, and exposure, the tent provides Adriana a sense of belonging and reprieve from unrelenting precarity. Adriana's experience of housing injustice extending over 5 years reveals the emotional toll of systemic neglect. They describe feeling forgotten by a they who I interpret to be people in positions of power, like policymakers who could stop this violence. Adriana's realization that they have been willfully forgotten is a feeling written by policy. And today, this willful neglect is represented by 15 mayors who want to see the notwithstanding clause used to remove folks from encampments. It is traumatizing to have nowhere to go and to feel like no one is coming to help. And in this way, feeling forgotten is very much related to what Anne Chekovic calls public feelings. They are created and sustained by a city that has no theory of justice. Okay, finally, I want to introduce us to Jamie. She's an Indigenous youth who moved to Toronto after living for years with no fixed address. And this is her zine. So in my reading of Jamie's zine submission, it reflects the profound emotional challenges of housing injustice while also gesturing towards things in life that promote resilience and hope. The first image features a girl sitting in a vestibule in a city. She sits on the concrete, and next to her is something that is plaid and it looks soft. I assume from this image that this space has been a place of refuge in a city, even if for a short time. I think it's worth noting that this place obviously is not designed for a young person to rest. And we can also see in the reflection of the door that she's not alone and has company. And in the caption, the image is called The Descent. Things will get worse before they get better. Keep your chin up. And this speaks to a raw, unfiltered acknowledgement of hardship, while at the same time inviting hope and encouragement for brighter days. The second image shifts from the city to a place with nature in the background, and it's not urban at all. There's a highway, there's concrete safety barriers, there's a border with a river, and there's a bridge in the background with large coniferous trees and rolling hills. And the caption says, "Waking up in paradise, even when you've hit rock bottom, life is beautiful." Jamie suggests a critical insight here about trauma and survival, where moments of connection to nature provide solace and meaning despite the violence of displacement. Adriana and Jamie's experience highlight how urban trauma, rooted in conditions of poverty and violence, cannot be separated from coloniality, resembling what Pratt names as a relational process of abandonment. It's not just exclusion, it's an active state of dispossession. And in this way, we can see how attachment injuries exist not just between people, but also between structures and the state. Achieving justice means recognizing that cities must be redesigned to meet the needs of all residents, particularly those most marginalized by colonial systems, and to create opportunities for healing, equity, and transformation. As Kristen Carden notes, justice for communities as an alternative to pathologizing suicidal individuals is perhaps a better way forward. And so I wanted to think concretely as much as possible about what some of the implications might be from the stories shared from Ivy, Jay, Adriana, and Jamie. And the fact that these four young people shared these stories means that they are actively resisting the logics of death and insisting that we make the world better. And so I'm going to review what I think some of the big emerging ideas are, and what they might mean for the field of suicidology. And I think in a lot of ways, they're not abstract and they resist intellectualization. So first, I think suicide justice might involve spatial justice for livability, and drawing from feminist geography, urban planners and architects have opportunities to show young people, especially young women and femfolk, that they are not forgotten and need not be pushed into the shadows of a city. This means designing spaces with young people in mind. And I think a great example in Toronto of working towards spatial justice is Regent Park, which directly involved the voices of young people. And it's redesigned, and the results are amazing. It's a neighborhood of complex high rises that's built around a youth center with a soccer field, a hockey rink, basketball courts, at the heart of the neighborhood, and it's a place of joy. Ivy, Jay, Adriana, and Jamie point to uncomplicated interruptions to suffering in cities like green spaces, spaces for social gathering without criminalization, a place to slow down in a city, to sit and to rest without hostile architecture, perhaps youth spaces that are open 24 hours and not more than a 15-minute walk apart. And I wonder what places of possibility might emerge from processes where young people are the active designers of their city, and what the health implications might be years down the line. I think suicide justice also means being against worldlessness and moving towards collective life. Billy Ray Belcourt notes that it is cause for alarm that we haven't sufficed in the project of making being in the world an arousing and joyous thing for all. In the words of Jeffrey Ansloos from Fisher River Cree Nation and Shanna Peltier and Anishinaabe from Wikiwemikong unceded territory, to keep people alive while simultaneously failing to build livable worlds is pathological. And so we might ask, do cities have a plan against this pathology? What would it take to make moves against coloniality? What would it mean for a city to rethink policies that center the health of women, femmes, and youth? We need to find ways of being that sustain collective life and promote livability in the long term, not just as a preventative reaction. And I imagine that this would involve a radical reorientation to economic justice, one where economic redistribution is prioritized through things like universal basic income, rent subsidies, livable ODSP, living wage, and comprehensive childcare supports. And other countries do this. So perhaps good suicide prevention is also collective and utopian. And finally, suicide prevention or good suicide justice is about effective justice. And what I mean by this is how can we take seriously, depathologize, and privilege the affects of young women and femme folk that are often silenced? Young people need ontological security, and the anxiety and depression that comes from places and spaces that do not invite belonging are felt in insidious and cruel ways, and it's not their fault. Young women and femme folk who struggle with housing injustice have a right to this world. And so, in solidarity with Jay, Ivy, Adriana, and Jamie, I'll end here. Thank you.
Wow. Use those reaction tools, everyone. I'm pretty floored. Nicole, that was incredible. It's been really incredible actually seeing this project from where it began as an idea to this iteration of it today. And I can see, yeah, just the journey of your sort of not just thinking through it, but also, yeah, the kind of like critical reflection on how the context, the political and social ecological context, has even shifted and intensified in the course of the research that you've engaged, like how hostile Canadian municipalities have become, and how intensifying these conditions of unlivability are. I have so many questions, but often in these seminars, I end up taking time asking questions, and I really actually want to make some time for folks. So if folks can, we have a Q&A box. You can submit an open question there. If you'd rather just come on the microphone and share your question, you can indicate so in the Q&A box, and then I'll highlight your name and give you room to talk. If anybody is having difficulty with accessing the Q&A or submitting to the Q&A, just put your hand up, raise your hand as a reaction. And or if you don't have that, maybe just use like the open mouth surprised face emoji, and I will kind of go through until I can find you. But I think the Q&A box should be working. Yeah. And I'll also allow attendees to submit anonymous questions if you don't want to be identified. I'm going to, just because I was getting some text, I'm going to invite some folks from the lab if you want to. I'm going to just allow you to ask questions if you'd like to get us started.
Hi, Nicole.
Hey, Deanna. Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Hi, everyone. Nicole, I'm glad I'm not on video because you dropped a few tears this morning. I think I'm so struck by what Jeffrey just said, like the